Welcome to the Carleena Show, where people from around the world share their personal journey. I'm your host, Carleena Angwin, and this is episode 27 of the podcast. Today on the show, we have Robyn Udemans in Saudi Arabia. Robyn is a South African woman who has been living in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia for 17 years. Knowing very little about life outside her compound's walls, Robyn decided it was time to change that. The result is a podcast called Aswat, Voices of Arabia, which serves as a platform for the women of Saudi Arabia to share the stories of their lives, aspirations, and achievements at a time when restrictions on women have been easing. You can visit the Carleena Show website at carleena.net to learn more about Robyn and link to her podcast. From there, you can find our past episodes, connect with me on social media, and sign up for the mailing list. Thank you, Stephen Lorca, for editing and production. And now I bring you Robyn Udemans. Robyn, what led you to Saudi Arabia?
Well, back in 2000, my husband had been offered a job with a company here in Saudi Arabia, but he didn't tell me about it initially. I found out about this at a family gathering in South Africa. And he announced over lunch that he had been offered a job in Saudi Arabia but had turned it down. And my reaction was, well, why would you do that? That's something we haven't discussed. This is a kind of a topic as a husband and wife you would talk about. And he said, well, it's in Saudi Arabia, and as a woman there, you can't drive, you can't work. My life would have been impacted more than anybody else's, really, and I think that's what he had in mind. And at that stage, I was running a photographic business in Cape Town. It was really a one-man show. I was doing everything on my own, lugging heavy equipment, making appointments. It was all done solely by myself. And at the same time, I had two young kids. Kevin traveled quite a lot with his work, so he was away a lot of the time. So the idea of having, a year off work sounded quite appealing to me at that stage. And, so once I told this to him, he got back in touch with the company who had approached him and basically started the whole process of, contract negotiation. And then later in October 2000, my kids and I arrived. Kevin had been here for a few months already, but once we'd got our paperwork sorted out, we arrived in the October of 2000.
So tell me a little bit about your life in Cape Town and what Cape Town is like.
Oh, Cape Town is beautiful. It's completely different to Saudi Arabia or to Jeddah. It's a very green city. Well, now maybe not so much because we've had water shortages and drought, but it's a beautiful city. You've got Table Mountain, you've got the Atlantic Ocean, you've got the Indian Ocean on the other side. There's just so much to do. You've got the winelands. You're quite spoiled for recreational activities. There's a lot to do. So coming from Cape Town to the desert, Saudi Arabia, where in 2000 there wasn't very much going on at all. It was a bit of a shift for us, I have to say.
Tell me what you did to prepare to go to Saudi Arabia.
Oh, we did a lot of research. And you must remember back in those days, we didn't really have internet. So it meant going to the library a lot. I went to I went to all the bookshops and bought whatever books I could about Saudi Arabia, for myself and Kevin, but also for our kids. We had to educate them as well. And I think with all of the research that we'd done, we were pretty well prepared for the move here. There were no huge culture shocks when we arrived. I knew what my limitations would be, the restrictions. I knew that shopping centres closed 5 times a day for prayer, so I had to be organized with my shopping. So it was basically just a matter of educating ourselves so that we would fit quite smoothly into life here, and I think that's really what happened. There were never any real shocks because we were really so prepared for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a problem with quite a few people, is they don't necessarily do that background research. And it's so different to anywhere else that it is a bit of a shock.
So tell me about your early days in Saudi Arabia. What was that like?
They were interesting. It was a completely different culture. So we were discovering so much about this place. We moved right in. We moved onto a compound from day one, and I think that helped a lot, because you basically have like a built-in support group, a community, who are all in the same boat, basically. So if you're having a bad day, you can sort of go down a few houses and knock on your friend's door and say, I'm really having a bad day. And they would know what you were talking about. Also, you must remember that for family and friends to come and visit was very difficult. Especially friends, it would be next to impossible. But family would be a little bit easier. So we really did miss the family in those early days. But as it was a point of discovery for us. We did a lot of camping. We made a lot of good friends on the compound. All expat people, because you have that physical barrier anyway, living on a compound with the community, and it wasn't really encouraged anyway back then. So our world really was the compound and our expat friends.
Is it required that you live on the compound, or is that a decision that you and your family made?
I think back then we didn't really know if we could live anywhere else but on a compound. And I think we didn't even investigate it any further, because a compound, was a small community, and that's what we wanted, especially having two young kids. They would have friends on the compound. So I think it was just something we didn't really even, look at an alternative for. A compound has everything that you need, and especially not being allowed to drive back then. They had a small supermarket, gym, hairdresser, restaurant. As I say, like a community here already. Drivers for women who can't drive, so we could get around from A to B. Shopping buses. So really, if you didn't want to leave the compound, you didn't have to, because everything is available here. And I think based on that, I think it definitely made life easier, having it all basically with, a couple of meters from your front door.
At what point did you start thinking about developing your podcast?
Oh, that was only last year. So I would say, 16 years later. It was an idea that I had because I really listened to a lot of podcasts. And it was around that time where things were starting to ease here with regards to women and women's rights. And just an idea that I had, that because I was so aware that, because we'd been living on a compound for so many years, we were unaware of what was going on outside the compound walls. And what really got me thinking about it was, I went home early last year and I had coffee with a friend from school, so someone I hadn't seen for 30 odd years. And I told her I was living in Saudi Arabia, and her reaction was, "What? That must be amazing. You must have so many interesting stories to tell." And I was embarrassed, because I really couldn't think of any interesting stories to tell, because I hadn't been exposed to the community around me. And I came back thinking I needed to change that. After having been here for so long, I needed to have more interaction with the community. And at that stage, it was getting a bit easier to do that. And because I listened to a lot of podcasts, I just thought, it's all audio. There's no video involved. And that would appeal to a lot of, Saudi women here, because there is, to a certain extent, still, this privacy, this sort of veil that is there. And they feel quite happy talking to a recorder as opposed to speaking to a camera. And I think that's really helped in this case.
So tell me a little bit about how things have changed for women in Saudi Arabia from the time you arrived to now.
Okay, so when I arrived, as I mentioned before, women were not allowed to drive. So you're reliant on your husband, drivers, taxis, or shopping buses, basically. Now women can drive. I don't have my license yet. It's not from lack of trying, but I'm just waiting for my appointment. Now we've got Uber and the equivalent to Uber, Kareem, which is a driving service, and you do see more and more women behind the wheel of the car, which is really amazing to see. It didn't happen suddenly overnight. It took a few months to sort of iron out any complications, but it seems to have gone quite smoothly since then. And you do see more and more women driving. So that's a huge thing, really, is the driving. You see more and more women working in public sector jobs, check-in at the airport, at the supermarket. For many years, if you went into an underwear store, the only person there to help you would be a male assistant, which was a little bit awkward. And they realized that. And I think that was one of the first places where women became more visible as assistants. You go into an underwear store now, and there are women to available to help you. Exercise now. 4 years ago, women weren't allowed to exercise in public, or it was very rare to see women exercising in public. And now women are running, cycling. Where they've even adjusted the abaya to be a sport abaya, so that those women who are really serious about it have got the flexibility to exercise in a sporty abaya. And if you walk down to the Corniche, which is about 2 blocks from where I live, in the evenings especially, you see groups of women exercising together, or even individually. That's really changed the whole makeup of the society here, is the fact that these women are able to exercise. And obviously with increased exercise, I think a lot of there are a lot more happy people here, because that does make a difference, being able to appreciate what's around you, and to exercise wherever you want is a big thing. Abayas, certainly where I am on the west coast, it's a lot more relaxed than Riyadh, which is the capital. Here we can wear any color abayas. Back then, when I arrived, only black abayas were acceptable. And abayas definitely do have a place, which might sound strange to someone not living here, but living here, if you have to go out, you really don't have to worry about what you're going to wear, because you're going to be covered anyway. So you generally have an abaya for evening, something that's a little bit more sort of dolled up, something it's a little bit smarter. You have a daytime abaya. I have a abaya for when I go to the beach. So you've got abayas that serve different purposes. So really the change now is that any color really goes. And in fact, you see more and more women not wearing an abaya, as long as they are covered. If you go into a supermarket or a shopping center, you see women walking around in sort of loose clothing, as long as it's not tight and revealing shape. That's become quite acceptable as well. And another big change is women have been allowed to watch into stadiums to watch football matches. That happened about, I think, 2 years ago now, and that was quite a big change. And more and more concerts have been happening around the area, around Saudi Arabia. We've had a few big name people coming out and performing concerts. So things are definitely improving and changing, and making up for lost time, really.
Yeah. So when did you start teaching ESL classes?
Oh, I taught very briefly. I did a CELTA course in Cape Town in 2014, and came back, and I did a sort of a freelance job for a couple of months. And it as I say, I didn't do it for very long.
Was it mostly women in your classes?
Oh, as a woman, I could only teach women. You've got that segregation. Only men can teach men. So in my case, I could only teach women or kids, basically.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about your classes and the interactions you had with your students.
The classes were the few classes that I had were amazing. I did quite a few conversational classes, which was great because it was quite relaxed. The idea was just to get to get these women speaking English, and they loved it. It was for them. It was like a social interaction, and quite an important time for them socially, because they were meeting and coming to meet at a specific time and place, and they made great friends from that. And there were some interesting stories that came out of the classes that I did. In one class, there was a young woman who had just graduated as a doctor, and she, her father had obviously supported her through the process. And then after her graduation, he discovered that she would have to treat males, and he told her that she wasn't going to be allowed to practice as a doctor. It was against his beliefs that women shouldn't treat men. And as a result, after a year after she graduated, she still wasn't working, and she was very frustrated. But in that same group, I had another woman whose father was encouraging her to learn English so that she could get her IELTS and eventually go and study overseas, to better herself. So you had these two extremes in one classroom, and it was amazing to see these women supporting each other and giving each other advice, and even just that, even in their broken English, you could see that they were standing together and wanting to help each other in a situation like that.
Mm-hmm. And how did women learn English previously before your class?
I think to a certain extent, schools offer English as an additional language. For some of them who hadn't learned, they would watch YouTube videos. Their line to learning English would be the internet, basically. Mm-hmm. So they would listen to songs, and I had one young girl who came, and she had this very strong American accent, and I assumed that she had studied in America, and it was purely from watching movies and YouTube videos that she had picked up this accent, and also how to speak English.
Mm-hmm. What are some other stories from those classes? What are some other things that people said that maybe surprised you or made you think, differently about yourself or about the world?
One of the things that surprised me was, and this goes to the stereotype of how people view Saudi women, is a lot of these women were very well educated. They'd studied, they got their degrees, and in Saudi universities, very, very highly qualified women, and who weren't able to, at that stage, weren't able to work in their field. So they weren't just happy sitting at home and, watching life pass them by. They went out and studied English and tried to network in various ways. They weren't content just to sit at home and wait for the time for when they would be able to go out and work.
Mm-hmm. While you were teaching the ESL classes, is this when you started thinking about doing your podcast, or did that just come when you had the visit with your friend in Cape Town?
No, it actually, you know what, because I was teaching or wanting to come up with interesting ideas for these women, this conversational class that I taught. I did a lot of research, and I found out this is where I found out about how amazing Saudi women are, because I hadn't realized that, there was a Saudi woman who was the first Saudi woman to climb Mount Everest, or the first Saudi woman to dive in the North Pole. And if it hadn't been for my teaching ESL, I probably wouldn't have known about that. And because after I discovered these two stories, I thought, well, there must be so many other stories out there. And I started looking and digging. And that's when I discovered that, there were all these amazing women from Saudi Arabia who had achieved so much. And nobody really knew about them, except for maybe their their social media groups, or, if they were really good on social media, then perhaps their followers. But certainly as an expat woman, I didn't know about these women. And that really piqued my interest. And I thought, well, there must be so many more people or women like this who are doing all these incredible things, and their stories should be told. And I guess that, coupled with my visit back home and meeting my friend after all those years, the pieces kind of fell into place. And I thought, well, if no one else is telling their stories, maybe this is an opportunity for you to tell their stories. Mm-hmm. And that's basically, and then I just started exploring the options, and, and I went through many days where I thought, no, this is a ridiculous idea. But then the more I looked on the internet and the more stories I saw, I thought, no, this is an opportunity to show people who don't know Saudi women, who have a specific idea about what a Saudi woman is, that these ideas are not necessarily correct. Mm-hmm. Because this is not what I was seeing through all my research.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And could you talk a little bit about the first guest you had on your show and how you approached them with the idea of the podcast? And were they hesitant at all to come on your show, or willing? Or could you talk about that a little?
The first episode that I did was about women driving, and that was a little bit frustrating because it hadn't happened yet, and I was trying to organize appointments for when it did happen. I really wanted to be in a car with a woman driving at midnight on the day that they were allowed to drive, and women were a little bit nervous about committing to that. So I put that one to bed. I put it on the side for a little bit, and then I decided I would come back to that. Because there would be, a couple of weeks after that where it would still be quite newsworthy. And then the next woman who I approached was Raha Muharak, and she is just, if you Google her name, she's all over the internet. And I've always been of the opinion, if you want something done, or if you want something, you need to ask. And the worst thing that can happen is that they'll turn around and say no. So I sent Raha an email, and the next day I got an email back saying, yes, no problem. I'll be in, and she was living in Dubai, and it was during Ramadan, so it was almost a year ago. And she said, I'll be in Jeddah for Ramadan. We can meet then. And so I had nothing to show her. I hadn't got an episode that as a sample. She really was trusting me in what I was telling her, that it was going to be a non-political, positive podcast, and just based on what I told her, she had agreed to do the interview. And in fact, all the other women were like that as well. They hadn't heard, they didn't know who I was. I found the easiest way to put their minds at rest, to show them that I was actually a woman, was to send them WhatsApp voice messages so that they could hear I was a woman, because that was a concern of mine, because, my name Robyn could also be a man's name. But generally speaking, I think I've only had one woman who wasn't interested in speaking to me. The rest have all been very excited about it. And their feedback, not feedback, but their reaction to when I say I have a podcast about women from Saudi Arabia, they all say that they think it's a fantastic idea, because, they're wanting to get these stories out there as well.
Mm-hmm. So could you talk a little about a couple of the other guests that you've interviewed, the episodes and the guests that stick out to you?
So I've done 14 episodes so far, and they've all been amazing women to interview. The one that really resonated with me was the episode called Cat Mama, and that's about Farah. And Farah is a woman who has 300 cats living with her, and she feeds an additional 600 street cats. And one thing about cats here in Saudi Arabia is that they are everywhere, and they're considered a pest. So there are many, many stray cats walking around. Farah's basically dedicated her life to these animals. She takes them in. She goes to these markets where cats are strays, and she'll put them in cages and take them back, and she'll feed them up and medicate them if they need to be medicated, and just give them a lease on life. And she basically hasn't had a holiday for 10 years because she's got no one else to look after these cats. It's basically herself, and I think she's got 2 or 3 helpers who come in during the course of the day just to relieve her. And hers is also quite a sad story, because after, I think it was 30 years of marriage, her husband left her. And he was the one who started feeding the cats. So she says that, with these cats have been abandoned, and she's been abandoned, but she's got such an incredibly strong faith, and I think the faith definitely has made it easier for her. Her family, she has a son, and he's back in the States, and she only gets to see him when he comes out to Saudi Arabia, so that's not very often, but her life is basically these cats. So her story was had quite an impact on me, because she's just this lovely person whose sole purpose in life, as far as she's concerned, is to save these cats, and that's exactly what she's doing.
Yeah.
Oh, there was another woman a young woman. She's 17 years old, and she's a free diver, which is quite an extreme sport. And at 17, she was just so incredibly mature for her age, and quite disciplined about training, and she's won the Egyptian national title, and her father is Egyptian, so she's got connections to Egypt. She was definitely one, just this dedication to her sport, basically. So she was very inspiring. Raha Muharak is another one. She's basically a Saudi woman who hasn't let anything stand in her way, and she's going for what she wanted. Her father initially said no, and she said to me that if she'd been her brother, she could guarantee that he would have paid for a plane ticket for her brother to go and climb Mount Everest. But because she was a woman, and at the age where Saudi women are expected to get married, he said no. But she didn't give up, and eventually he said that she could do it, and he's become her biggest sort of cheerleader, so to speak. But what really surprised me about these women is how open they are, and how much they love their country, and how proud they are to be Arab women. I mean, the words that they use to describe themselves: resilient, amazing, enduring, strong. These are all words that come up in during the interview. They haven't spent their time feeling any resentment about restrictions in the past. They've really hit the ground running with all these changes.
Have you had any of your guests mention that maybe they would want to start a podcast?
No, nobody yet. I think that the podcasting world here is quite small. Although I did meet a podcasting group the other day, which is quite fun. I made contact with. I know there are about quite a few other podcasting people. What do you call it? Podcasting platforms.
Yeah.
Yeah. Groups, and I made contact with about 7 of them, I think, and only one of them got back to me. And my husband and I went to meet them the other day. They were having a live podcasting session because Game of Thrones is starting again, I think on Sunday, and they're a big gaming podcasting group, and so we went and spent a couple of hours with them, and that was quite fun. So I'm hoping that the podcasting community will get bigger and bigger here, but I think it's early days still.
Yeah. And what has been the response from your podcast?
It's been positive. It's quite difficult to really answer that question because you don't really get that much feedback. I have had emails saying, they really enjoy what I'm doing, and they followed me, and it's interesting to hear about, what women here are doing. But generally speaking, there there hasn't been much feedback. And I guess no news is good news.
Do you get
I'm gathering.
do you
I'm
get
not sure.
feedback from your guests who listen to the podcast? And
Oh yes, oh yes. So the women who I've interviewed have all been, very delighted with the results, which was always good to hear. And they've really enjoyed the process. And it's really fun because I go there. These are women who I don't know at all. They don't know me, and we just sit down over a cup of coffee or a bottle of water, whatever is available, and we just chat. And so it's quite a relaxed conversation of from their part as well. And that I think that does come through with the interviews. And I think I leave with them feeling that it hasn't been a chore. It's been a good experience talking about what they've been up to.
how has this process of creating the podcast and interviewing the women, how has that changed you, or what impact has that had on you?
Oh my goodness, yeah. I'm generally quite a shy person. I find talking. I'm not. I don't like making small talk. Let's put it that way. And I found that making this podcast, I am just interested in people. Standing at a carousel waiting for my suitcase. If I see a woman standing there, I'll strike up a conversation with her because you never know. It could be somebody really interesting. And it's just opened my eyes to what life is like here for a Saudi woman. And as I say, there is a stereotype about what Saudi women are like, and that's not what I'm seeing at all. I'm really amazed at how open they are. They'll invite you into their home, and they won't tell me they don't want to talk about X, Y, and Z. I can ask them anything, and if they're comfortable answering it, they'll answer the question. But it's made me feel like I'm a bit more part of a community. I'm not just an outsider, and I guess it's sort of broadened my friendship base to a certain extent. Although we don't necessarily hang out together post episode. But if I need anything, they're just a WhatsApp call away, basically. And this the same. I've often referred to one or two of them. I've asked them if they've got contacts for a specific story I'm working on, and within half an hour they'll give me an answer. So I think there's a mutual respect there on both of our parts.
Mm-hmm. And do you get the impression that other would you call yourself an expat? Is that the correct term?
Yeah, I'd be an
Okay, an
expat.
expat.
Yes.
So, is it your impression that other expats who live in the compound with you want to learn more about the culture and meet women, or is this something that's unique to you?
I can't answer for them. I'm sure there must be other women who are expat women who are interested to know what is going on out there. And I know I'm not the only one. I know there's an American woman here, and she has a Facebook group and a blog, and she's been doing that for a few years. There's another expat woman in Riyadh. She's married to a Saudi, and she's been on social media with regards to Saudi Arabia for about 6 or 7 years, I think. So there are a couple of other women who are doing highlighting Saudi Arabia and the people here to a certain extent. As to the rest of the expats, I'm not quite sure. I think it's quite easy just to become involved in just your routine of going to work and coming home and planning your next trip away, because I certainly lived that life for a while. But then it became a point where that wasn't enough for me, and I needed to know. And I know that I would have regretted not having done this, when we go home and I look back on all the years we've spent here, because I realize that I have wasted quite a few years already. I mean, the fact that I can't speak Arabic, and I'm not alone in that, because English is so widely spoken here. But that's definitely something I would love to do still, is learn Arabic. Mm-hmm. But I think just for me at the time and the way that things were working out in my life, having been exposed to these women teaching that conversational class, and realizing that there was a lot more to them than people realize. I think that definitely has opened my eyes just my whole way of viewing how I live here as well.
Yeah. So what's next for you?
Well, at the moment, I've been just concentrating on finding stories in the Jeddah area. But Saudi Arabia is a big country. We've got Riyadh, which is in the center of Saudi Arabia, and then Al Khobar, which is on the east coast. And I would love to explore these cities and find more stories about women there. I think there must be so many women who are doing interesting things, or who've achieved interesting milestones, or just achieving interesting things in their lives. That I think this is going to keep me busy for as long as I wanted to, and as long as I'm here.
You mentioned that you get some feedback, but in the sense of follows and comments like that, what other feedback would you find helpful on your podcast?
You mean from listeners?
From listeners. From listeners or guests.
It's always good to find out what other subjects they'd like to learn about. Because basically I'm just going on what I find interesting, and and I'm assuming that what I find interesting, other people find interesting too as well. And I hope this is the case. But certainly feedback from listeners as to what else would they like to hear about from Saudi Arabia. I think that would be a big one, definitely.
Anything else that you'd want to share?
No, I think that's all. Just the fact that I mean, I think the Saudi women, these women are amazing, and I think people have they've been misrepresented in the media, and I think that people need to know that they're not sitting at home waiting for their husbands or fathers to come home and give them permission to go out. That's certainly not the case. And that they don't want people to think that they are like that as well. They've got an incredible amount of pride. They've got an incredible amount of pride, and they definitely hold their heads up high.
And where can people find you?
I'm available on, or the podcast is available on iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, TuneIn. I have a website address. It's voicesofArabia.xyz, and Instagram and Facebook, Twitter. I think those are all the major ones.
Okay, and we'll put a link to your website in the description, so people can just click on that, and then it'll go to your website where they can visit any one of those social media accounts, and then also subscribe on their podcast app of choice. So, well, Robyn, it's been a pleasure talking to you and learning about your journey, and I wish you the best of luck.